A very good afternoon, friends, all the dear participants and Dr. Tomar. So we are on the third lecture, which is actually the second part of this nuclear medicine and radiopharmaceuticals. You will recall that we built up a case with some exciting isotopes like technetium-99m, fluorine-18. And we also saw plenty of things are happening in terms of the cancer management type of. So to begin with the applications, I want to shift gear. I don't want all of us to only think that the nuclear medicine radiopharmaceuticals work only for cancer. There are other important areas, like for example, our heart function, that I thought will be a very appropriate example to begin with. So today we begin with what the nuclear medicine and radiopharmaceuticals can contribute towards management of cardiac disorders or heart disorders. To just understand a bit better about that, all of us will know like that the heart is the very important organ which pumps the blood to all parts of the body to get their nutrient, oxygen, everything like. So the pumping action of the heart is a very, very key thing. And that pumping action of the whole heart muscle called the myocardium, or more particularly the left ventricle part of the heart. You know, the heart has 4 chambers, right ventricle, right atrium, left ventricle, left atrium. The left ventricle is the one which pumps the blood to all over the body part of it. So that part of the heart muscle should get in turn adequate blood supply to be able to very well function and do that pumping action. In order to do the pumping action, the myocardium, the heart muscle, has to be receiving adequate blood flow. And whether that is deficient or okay, if that can be demonstrated, it will be a very, very great boon. And this was very well recognized the moment nuclear medicine radiopharmaceuticals came into picture. So there was a lot of interest in imaging what we call the myocardium, that is the heart muscle. What would be a normal standard radiopharmaceutical to go? Because in the myocardial cells, the potassium is the major intracellular cation. So if you will have a potassium radioisotope from the blood, that will exchange and be into the myocardial cells, and you will be able to get the image. But you may recall, some of you at least, that we mentioned there is no suitable potassium isotope for imaging. We have listed the desirable properties for imaging. And if you look at the radionuclide chart and look at any isotope of potassium, like potassium 43, 38, etc., they all will not fit it at all. So another analog, a thallium, thallus ion, which is similar to potassium in terms of the ionic size and charge, had a good isotope called thallium-201. And therefore, that thallium-201 could become a good radiopharmaceutical for this myocardial perfusion. But very early on, when it started in mid-70s, they did not yet have the tomographic slides. They only had what is known as planar gamma camera. This is how the heart left ventricle shape and was there. And there will also be shadow and other background informations were there. But still, these images were quite good. And with the result, what we were able to demonstrate as the blood flow being adequate, or wherever there is a deficient area in the myocardial muscles, a branch of nuclear medicine, virtually nuclear cardiology, was born. But very soon, it was recognized that with the superior instrumentation, the SPECT, single photon emission computed tomography, we can get still much better images. See these 2 images and these images. There will be a much better clarity here. This is because the same isotope thallium potassium analog is what is used as the radiopharmaceutical, but the image is now taken in the tomographic mode, and that gives you a much, much superior image. And this really gave a big boost to both nuclear cardiology and the program. But there are some issues with producing the thallium-201 compared to 99M technetium. 99M technetium, comes from the Molytech generator. We saw about it, and it's available every week practically in every hospital. Whereas thallium-201 in mid-70s, as it was introduced, it comes from a cyclotron-produced product. It has a 3-day half-life. So transportability was there, but at that time, except in some limited number of countries with that cyclotron of 30 MeV protons, it was not producible. and there was always plenty of technetium available. Therefore, people worked on a number of approaches to develop technetium-based cationic complexes, which could mimic potassium plus. This is not exactly the ionic similarity alone, but it was like a variety of biochemical means to try. So monocationic, moderately lipophilic technetium complexes, large numbers were developed and studied, and two of them called System B, which is a hexakis isonitrile complex, NC the isonitrile group, and technetium is in one oxidation state. So complex, and also another one called tetrophosphine, that's also a monocationic and moderately lipophilic, and they could show fairly good myocardial uptake and an imageability, though they were not exactly similar to thallium-201 in terms of all the properties. But because technetium is more freely available and these products could be made, the technetium-based radiopharmaceuticals for myocardial imaging became extremely popular, and as already we saw, the technetium energy suits extremely well the gamma camera and the SPECT. Therefore, equally good images like with thallium, the technetium, even though it is totally alien to the human physiology and biochemistry, using suitable organic compounds and as ligands and a complexation with the technetium using its transition metal properties, very good progress could be made, and that has ushered in an extremely important wing of nuclear medicine called nuclear cardiology. The life went on like that till about 2000, when both medical cyclotrons and positron emitting tracers have become more popular, and therefore you could now get another potassium analog. Like sodium potassium in the same periodic group, you get rubidium, and rubidium has isotope rubidium-82 positron emitter, but it's an extremely short-lived one, 1.3 minutes half-life. But its precursor nuclide is strontium-82 with 25 days. So a strontium-rubidium generator can give rise to rubidium isotope. But the important beauty is that is exactly directly a potassium plus analog. So exactly like potassium, it will be an intracellularly taken up, and therefore you can get very good images. PET images were possible, and that became another important radiopharmaceutical. So you have both based on gamma camera SPECT as well as PET, suitable nice isotopes are available. So you could show the blood flow to the left ventricular masses, which gives you the important. But how is normally these studies done? You would have heard about, somebody who is unwell and has had a problem with heart. They would say he has to undergo a stress test. What does that mean? You are asked to do a certain amount of exercise, stress, and at that time, whether your heart function is okay is what is being monitored by what's known as a treadmill test, where when you do the exercise, your ECG is also recorded and you get to see whether it's functioning well or not. The very same thing is done with the radioisotopic nuclear cardiology procedure. The patient is asked to exercise under the care of the doctor, everybody, and then at the peak of the exercise, the radioisotope is injected. Therefore, now the blood flow will be as you have been maximum level of stress point. Like you have had an exercise, and whichever part of the myocardial muscles are receiving full supply or less supplied because you have done the exercise, there would be the difference. And this could be like demonstrated very well using it. Just see this one image. Here, this coloration is the radioactivity part. You will find there is abnormality. Here it is one color, here it is much less. Whereas in this one, you are finding it more or less all similar. These two are the images. This is the one taken when the patient is at the maximum the physical exercise stress when the injection had been given. And at that time, the blood flow tracer uptake in this part is fairly harmonious, whereas in this part, it is relatively less compared to that. So which means this part of the heart muscle is receiving relatively less blood supply. That means there is some small block equivalent is there. But the same thing is not visible very directly when you are under normal rest conditions, which means for the rest condition functioning, pumping of the heart, the blood flow is adequate. Whereas when you have to do certain amount of exertion, exercise, you may not be able to do. So this is very important because this is an important indication of what is known as stress-induced ischemia. We are normally required to do a certain amount of activity. When you are doing that exertion, if the heart cannot pump well, we are under certain risk. And this kind of information could be very nicely be detected. And traditionally, always the top line of the pictures represent at the physical maximum exercise stress condition, and these pictures are the rest condition. Once again, you can see here very clearly very big differences in the stressed condition compared to very well here. So these represent here the cells are not dead, the cells are viable, but they are under great stress. They are not getting adequate blood supply at the time of when they have to perform the maximum amount of exertion. So certain amount of intervention may be needed in these patients. Very similar thing for variety of parts, different segments of the heart, pictures can be taken. That is the type of the picture shown all over here. So this particular study of myocardial perfusion imaging is extremely important and a good component to what you do as treadmill stress test. It is not that you put every patient through it. It is for a select group of cardiac patients. For example, sometime what will happen is when you do the stress ECG, the results may not be completely unequivocal. They could be having some level of degree of clarity problem. And in such a case, like normally as a benefit of doubt, the patient will still be treated as if he is a cardiac patient and may have to be subjected to further investigation, which will include what is known as coronary angiogram. In order to avoid that, if a blood perfusion study could be done and if you could demonstrate the perfusion is okay or not okay, correspondingly a call can be taken as the further intervention. In some other case, for example, a person is already known to have a problem. They are planning whether there could be an intervention possibility. And in that intervention time, how much of the myocardial muscle has already been totally damaged versus how much of the myocardial muscles are intact. This, what's called the viability to be shown like, can also be done using the myocardial perfusion image. So that's the importance and extremely large. Western countries, it is said nearly virtually 50% of all nuclear medicine studies are on cardiac patients, which is a very large percentage. Even 40 to 50 is very large. Just to assure and say that these are very well established, very nicely done thing. Like I can share the information that quite a few prime ministers and presidents of our India, they have had their myocardial perfusion imaging done at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, and some of the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission here at the Jasloke Hospital, Bombay. It's a very standard routine procedure, no big problem, few hours of the hospital, and then the images are done, and that information content becomes an extremely important information base to decide on what would be the further methodology of handling everything. So now we should move on back to our cancer part, because that's the larger role and scope of the nuclear medicine. As you know, many cancers create their metastatic sites in the bone, particularly of the prostate cancer, lung cancer, breast cancer patients invariably develop the secondaries, which are called the metastasis in the bone. And therefore, it was known that bone scan by radioisotope nuclear medicine can have an extremely important role in the management of these patients. Very early on, even before the gamma camera came, this is like a basic information, knowledge known. So there was a great interest. And the fluorinating isotope as fluoride was because it will be similar to your, the bone mineral, and therefore it will be taken up by the bone. There was a great interest. But at the time, they didn't have a camera and the scanner, which means it's like a point by point detection, line by line detection. So point by point, line by line, a small organ is all right. Suppose you have to do the skeletal system head to foot, that will be absolutely not be okay. Even though the interest was there, there was some limited work done. It remained as limited historical interest. Then when the technetium-99m came into the picture, there was a lot of efforts using the phosphate bone affinity, and therefore either using a pyrophosphate or a still better agent instead of the POP in the pyrophosphate. If you have phosphonate with the PCP bond, this will be more stable and more in vivo, that is in the blood in vivo system, it will be a better agent. Therefore, a simple diphosphonate compound called methylene diphosphonate with technetium. This was in fact the first of the technetium product, which was patented way back in the mid 70s or late 70s because of the importance feeling that was the first one which could give good bone images. And that images as obtained and shown over here, they reveal the metastatic sites to do with either any one of these cancers. And that became an extremely important and a very large amount, particularly in the developing countries world. One of the very, very routine procedure being performed in nuclear medicine is this diphosphonate-based technetium bone imaging. You can almost say it's about 40%. But this is not basically for the detection itself. It tells you the total number of metastases, the location, how many are there around. And based on that, a staging of the patient can be done. Some of the times we do carry the bad news that it's already in the 3rd stage or the 4th stage, but that is still a very vital information both for the families and the clinician with reference to the management. And therefore, bone imaging became extremely important. But as you know, in the last 15-20 years, the PET and the medical cyclotron have been back. And therefore, now you can use the fluoride not with the old scanner, but with the beautiful positron emission tomography. You see the image here on the left-hand side. This is the kind of the sharp thing. You can see all the metastatic sites shining up here. And that's a very, very big advantage of the fluorine-19-based PET with reference to locating the thing like. And this had therefore become another of the extremely important and large-scale imaging procedure performed. Either use the SPECT and with the technetium, or you can still do it with fluorine. And fluorine has a better biological properties, so it's supposed to be picking up much more of the bone metastasis. And 2 examples we are shown over here. One is the patient of the prostate cancer, another is the patient of a breast cancer. And you can see, we don't need to be medical doctors. This is the normal bone distribution. One is the anterior view, another is the posterior view. That is, you are seeing the patient from the front and from the back. So the spine is more prominently seen here. And in the same way here, anterior view and the posterior. And you can see the large amount of the kind of the metastasis. These are real bad cases of patient. Probably the patient was already in the 4th stage. But that information importance. And also in case they are able to be treated by some means, some chemotherapeutic drugs or the radiotherapy information, the follow-up you can do with the same bone scan, whether the same level of degree of this will become the reference point, and the new image, whether it is showing similar metastasis or less in number. The kind of a evidence-based, you are able to show objectively images, pictures, and also certain quantitation will also be possible even within the site. In this site, this much tracer was now taken, maybe post-treatment 3 months down the line, how it is. So the bone scan becomes an extremely important one, but this is not cancer specific. Any cancers which come into the bone, you will be able to do the imaging. Therefore, the bone imaging, this became very important. Later, we will also see in terms of the therapy, some of these terminal people will develop a lot of bone pain. And for that, for the same mechanism, we will be able to think of a therapy and it's in practice. But that we will come to it much later. Now, beyond the bone, now we come to our beautiful isotope fluorine-18 and the fluorodeoxyglucose that we talked about. Because all the metastatic proliferating cells are extremely active and therefore they are consuming a very large amount of a glucose. This glucose utilization gives rise to lovely, beautiful images using your PET methodology, and you are seeing this kind of images everywhere, like in the cancer patient. But here it is not only to the bone. This can be in any soft tissue or other tissue also. That is the beauty of the FDG-based metastatic scanning versus the bone imaging agents doing. And since the metastasis beyond the bones can be there in many other cancers, the FDG-based imaging becomes extremely important. It is not so much used with reference to the initial diagnosis itself, but once again, similar to the bone scanning done, the staging and the prognosis, the tumor grading, how bad it is, how much it has spread, and what could be the prognostic follow-up when we are able to do like. It can also do certain thing like, after the surgery is done to remove the main tumor, like how much is the tumor mass left behind. This becomes a very useful information for the clinician. And also sometimes the difference between a fresh recurrence versus a complete scar to do with the surgically removed or chemotherapeutically treated thing, whether there is any recurrence there or not. Because in the recurrence, the radioisotope will go more prominently. Therefore, you will be able to see it very clearly. So that becomes an important index. So these are the variety of information which the fluorodeoxyglucose-based PET imaging will give in the cancer patients. the diagnosis of the recurrence. And in the case of suspected material, the disease has relapsed again, it has come back, then restaging the patient. And also, as you are treating, how well the therapy control, whether the patient has really responded or not. If you are able to periodically do the imaging, if these secondaries are all they're getting reduced or completely removed, that means the therapy model has been extremely well working. This also helps in certain cases, because if they are treating by chemotherapy also, whether the chemotherapy has been working effectively or not, instead of waiting for several cycles to go, they could have a quick feed by doing a bone scan, FDG scan earlier, and using the FDG scan, they can say how well the patient is responding, and with that, whether it would be helpful to continue or whether you should switch over to another mode. These huge benefits are all coming through with the F18, fluorodeoxyglucose-based imaging of cancer patients in oncology. In fact, the PET advantages, the coincidence detection, the quantitation ability, and this one single merit of this isotope to do has virtually made what the PET-CT-based nuclear medicine today is. Today in the world, it is said there are more than 1,200 medical cyclotrons, and with a 2-hour half-life isotope, virtually every day 1 or 2 batches minimum. So greater than 1,000 lots are being produced world over of this isotope and the product. So the total quantity will come something like kilocurie levels, and virtually every 10 seconds, one fluorine-18-based cancer imaging in one patient or the other is already going on. This would not have been that readily possible, but for an excellent radiochemical synthetic method being developed, which is very important. Because we talked about the 2-hour half-life, which means this isotope from production to get to the final pharmaceutical should be a very rapid process. So the simplified methodology will be, this is your FDG glucose. So you try to protect all these groups, and your particular place where the fluorine has to come, support material like it's called the triflate, that ligand is kept here. And this chemistry innovation synthesis worked out by Karl Hamacher of Germany was a very big turning point, because that simplified the whole process, protect all the groups, bring in the fluorine-18 by exchange here, and then hydrolyze all these protected groups. All these hydrolyzed protected groups are hydrolyzed, and this place has been changed with your fluorine-18. A simple 2-step procedure which could be done through an automated module, so that if you are handling several hundred millicuries or even curie level of fluorine-18 and the FDG is being produced, because of the 2-hour half-life, yes, you need to produce very large amount, allow in fact decay through the transient period in order to reach it to that. But this has been worked out extremely well. These type of automated module, more than one type, all of them are using this kind of a procedure. And also a lot of these kind of work development is what gives rise to scope for future research, as well as postdoctoral and other fellowship arrangements for a variety of compounds. Fluorodeoxyglucose is one important, but there are many, many others which could also be there. So much so, with the fluorine-18 gaining popularity and the cyclotrons, other positron emitter isotopes, these are all known. Gallium-68 and copper-64 were not unknown. They were known in 80s, 90s, but there were no takers. There was no medical cyclotron. Now they are there since 2000 everywhere, and the interest has come back to using all those kind of isotopes also. I think I mentioned to you about the Indian Association of Nuclear Chemists and Allied Scientists. Their website you can go. Out of the bulletin, one of them which we have brought out is dedicated to the positron emission tomography, the products and the procedures. It gives you a lot of information on that. I will anyway list all of them in the bibliography part of it. Like that will give a good background with reference to the whole thing. Like just one final word with reference to the same field, that how much large the whole field has become. Like it is not just one product, because fluorodeoxyglucose is the major one you are using. Fluorine-18 is available. Why not other biological compounds, amino acids, steroids, and other drugs and so on? Believe it or not, they are all available for different applications, but relatively limited number of patients studied or used compared to the large-scale use of the FDG in the cancer patients. Even in the cancer patients, cancer-specific, tumor-specific, more specific molecules have emerged, and many of them are in different happens. May not be every 10 seconds one fluorodeoxyglucose type of imaging, maybe 1 in 1 minute or in that ratio difference like, but a very large number of different biochemical mechanisms exploited, procedures and products are available. And this also goes to the other positron emitters beyond the fluorine. Gallium-68 based, rubidium-82, copper-64. Some of them are mentioned here, peptide ligand, binder ligand. We will see some of them later when we go to the tumor imaging. One more important part I should mention is in terms of the neurology. In the neurology, there is a lot of research for which the PET tracers have been extremely useful in terms of doing scientific medical research work. And some of them help you in managing the degenerative diseases. The dementia is a degenerative disease. There is no direct cure in most of them, but you can retard the progression of the disease. So if you can detect a tendency towards getting into that very early on, and you already start retarding the progression of the disease, you are sort of delaying the onset of the disease problem for the patients. Such work are possible through the radiopharmaceutical nuclear medicine procedures. This is again another area where plenty of research work is going on. Again, scope for a lot of R&D, postdoctoral type of work, and with the pharma companies too, could be there. So today in the world, if I said there is more than 1,200 medical cyclotrons, we have in India 21, but mind it, we have more than 300 PET-CT. They have all come within the last 12 plus years, 12 to 15 years, 20 years, all of them have come. They have not come purely by marketing because of the extreme important role that they make. We should move on to more specific tumor tracers. We first saw bone because that is the residence point for many tumors. Therefore, you do the bone imaging using. Then we came to the fluorinating FDG. That's not only to the hardcore bone part. It can be in the soft tissues, muscles, everywhere like any tumor it will take. Again, it will take any tumor. Can we be more specific? A particular strategy for this tumor, how do I do it? This interest has always been there. They generally look for any kind of biochemical which may be associated with the tumor, particular tumor. And whether you can target that biochemical in that tumor, then we are doing a very specific tumor imaging. One of the interest was tumors of the neuroendocrine origin, for example, the pancreatic type of tumor. They do have this particular receptor, somatostatin receptor, which is something like about a 14 amino acid kind of containing moiety of it. And for that, they have a binder ligand called octreotide. The octreotide is an 8 amino acid peptide thing and that can bind to the somatostatin receptor. So if you have a radioisotope which can be coupled to the peptide octreotide, it could give rise to a good radiopharmaceutical towards an imaging arrangement. And this is what created very early on. Mind it, this is in the 90s I am talking about, a very nice interest to do a very specific tumor imaging. We are talking about neuroendocrine tumors, for example, the pancreatic type. You are going on a biochemical which is specific with the tumor and looking for a particular binder, which is in this case octreotide. But unlike technetium-99M, indium was not that very popular in those days. And we still had the SPECT. The SPECT was just about emerging. Only planar gamma camera was very popular. So in the lack of an adequate imaging instrumentation and the indium isotopes free availability, even though concept was nice and available, this never really sort of took off. Whereas around 2000, when now you have the nice medical cyclotrons, PET tracers, including indium, everything being available, the very same strategy. We still go for the octreotide, but instead of going with indium 111 as the M3 element, you go with the gallium-68 positron emitter that is also an M3, and to link it with the peptide instead of DTPA, another linker molecule called DOTA, that could be there, and then you get this kind of a image. Beautiful. Because of the PET, it could be done. It's basically extremely biochemically strategic because you are knowing what are the receptors on the tumor overexpressed, and you have the peptide which will bind to those receptors, and you are sending that peptide with your radioisotope, and externally you are imaging. So the peptide-based, the strategic tumor targeting imaging has arrived. And that which was already visualized, conceptualized, could now be produced and done. And that made another major milestone point. and the image quality is like exceptionally good. So you have FDG on one hand, then on another hand, gallium-68. Gallium-68 is a 1 hour half-life isotope. It was initially only available through the generator germanium-68, gallium-68, but there are other methods of directly producing gallium also now. We will perhaps see that at one of the slides. And therefore, today, gallium has become another important addition to the PET imaging methodology beyond the fluorine-18. Not only for this one cancer, but a number of other arrangements. So this is what is the kind of the structure. This is actually the DOTA molecule, where you have actually, it is a cyclic compound with 4 nitrogens here, and in between is where the gallium gets complexed. And once again, simplification of the radiochemical procedures are important, without which it cannot work, because the half-life here is hardly 1 hour, and you cannot afford to, and it's not directly getting produced, at least to begin with, in the cyclotron. So you can't have it in Curie levels. Fluorine-18 gave you that luxury advantage. You can produce much larger, even after decay you could use. Whereas gallium, coming from the germanium-68 gallium, was also precious. So every microcurie, every second, every minute is important. But simple synthetic methods, after a lot of R&D and work, it doesn't come overnight. This is the final procedure. But once it is arrived, now it's relatively simple and straightforward to make. And then you get extremely nice images like what we saw in the preceding slide. But a step beyond that has also taken place, which we will just mention today, but more proceed with that later. Because here basically what we are using is an M3 radioisotope and a particular group which takes the material radioisotope into the tumor site itself. Your interest was for imaging, therefore we were doing with the gallium-68. So in the place of gallium, the other radio metal, lutetium-177, which is the M3 again, if that is put, you are again going to get a very similar complex, similar to the gallium here. The lutetium is put, and now this is going to be possible for a therapeutic dose. Like the images here are showing actually the patient done with the gallium image, like how much is the large spread of kind of the secondaries are there. And such a patient like could be then be treated with this lutetium-177 and the same carrier molecule, DOTA-8. And that means an octreotide type of peptide based, we are able to use it like, and with the result, we are able to get an extremely good progress towards possibly doing a therapeutic methodology. This we are going to cover later, but because it was part of the same slide, I just wanted to mention it. But remember, the simplification for a 1 hour half-life isotope, which cannot be produced in very large quantities. You don't have the luxury of allowing that to decay. So therefore, we have to have a very good methodology. They have been standardized. This is available today. And therefore, a large amount of neuroendocrine type of cancers could be done using this kind of a biotype. Just want to list a few of the major isotope part. This is more for you to carry in your notes. We need not really dwell on every one of the individual columns here, like, because we have heard repeatedly about the properties, some of the compound names, where exactly they are used. But probably this last one, like, will tell you, like, which are very large established, like in the case of technetium and fluorine-18, gallium-68 is growing, and growing importance is coming around, like, and some of the isotopes, even though they were very helpful, they have been now overridden because there have been alternates, replacements. Thallium is one where replacements have come. And two of the isotopes which were very nice and useful for imaging, but they could not take off. Iodine isotope, iodine-123, and indium isotope, indium-111. They still are available, but relatively low utilization. And the ubiquitous iodine-131 has a limited amount of a diagnostic use. We will be shifting gear to now the therapy part of it, because I just mentioned to you when I mentioned about the gallium DOTA-8, gallium peptide-based neuroendocrine strategic specific tumor imaging. The moment you have now come to specific tumor imaging, the immediate possibility will be, can we have, instead of the imaging agent, the same vector molecule to deliver a therapeutic radioisotope, and whether we can get the therapeutic effect in that. And this is what becomes an important approach, which we will be covering in much greater detail over the next one. But this slide is just to tell, similar to what we had a list in the case of the diagnostic, What have all been the isotopes for the therapy? Iodine 131, we already mentioned the lutetium 177. It has a counterpart yttrium because the beta energy here is middle level 0.5 MeV. We need certain high energy beta energy for certain applications. So that is given by the yttrium 90. And there is potential to use some alpha emitters, even though they are not yet in the place, but they could be in future. Right now, there are some lot of interest in actinium 225. So this is just to give a kind of a listing of the type of the isotopes, their half-lives, properties. I deliberately put phosphorus 32 and struck it off because P32, similar to iodine, was of interest for some therapy in the past. But again, that has been overridden. Today, very little P32 may be getting used, and therefore that will not be much be there. There is a World Council on Isotopes newsletter where an article of mine is there. Once again, it will get listed in the bibliography. There I have taken potassium, fluorine, and iodine as a standard. So I have mentioned it is the radioisotope discussion beyond the standard trio. The standard trio are the iodine 131, 99M, technetium, and fluorine 18. Beyond that, what are all the isotopes of relevance for nuclear medicine, be it for diagnostics or the therapeutic? That would again be a useful reference material. Out of these listed here, we are going to look at one because they have been more recent entrants like lutetium, yttrium, this rhenium, as against iodine or technetium, which had been extremely well established since very long. So we'll spend a couple of minutes on the lutetium part. You will recall also that Dr. Tomar did mention part of this in his presentation also, because the lutetium 177 is having about a week's half-life, which is very convenient in terms of production logistics, making, distributing. Where it is important, we are living with a 2-hour half-life isotope fluorine 18, fine, because that is only needed in the diagnostic quantities. Whereas when you come to lutetium, you are going to require therapeutic much larger quantities. And therefore, it is better that if there is a little longer half-life, which is making life easier, and that it has got. And again, energy 0.5 MeV is very ideally suited for many of the normal lesions over which the radiation will have to be deposited. You will recall when we mentioned the ideal properties of a therapeutic nuclides, I mentioned about low abundance gamma emission will help imaging and dosimetry. Here we have a 15% 177 keV. Low abundance gamma around less than 200, nicely fitting with the SPECT gamma camera system. So this property renders it amenable for imaging as well as dosimetry computations. And finally, what happens? It's a M3 chemistry, transition metal. Radiolanthanide it is. It's the M3 chemistry, which is what we have exploited in the case of gallium, indium, and all. Therefore, we will be able to very well utilize it. So all these put together, it has made this particular isotope extremely useful. You do need an enriched target of lutetium 176 because its natural abundance is hardly 2.6%, but it has a large neutron absorption cross section, one of the highest, 2000 bonds. So you can produce it relatively easily. We will get a specific activity in this range of greater than 20 millicurie per milligram. But irradiation time, you remember the number of half-lives which Tomar mentioned to you. Here, if it is about 7 days, if you irradiate for 14 days, it will be better. 21 days, even better. 28 days, better. So you need to continue to irradiate for about 3 to 4 weeks in order to achieve this kind of a higher specific activity. But in that period, when you prolong the activation, you are also producing an isotopic impurity to lutetium 177, namely 177M lutetium, which is a long half-life product. And that's not an impurity which you like to have in the final product. Therefore, you have to reduce the number of days of irradiation, which will reduce the impurity content. But methods have been worked out. People are doing it. And it goes to the credit of India and IAEA jointly for popularizing the lutetium to where it is. Because of the importance of the lutetium and the specific activity limitation of getting only around 20 millicurie per milligram, an alternate route of obtaining lutetium from its precursor radioisotope, which is ytterbium 177 of about 2-hour half-life. So if you produce ytterbium 177 2-hour half-life and let it decay into lutetium, your job is done. And in that lutetium will be virtually what we call no carrier added product. No carrier added product. Tomar also mentioned about that to you. So this will be like an extremely high order of specific activity. than what is available here, 20 millicurie per millicurie. That will permit you to use it for certain very sophisticated radiopharmaceuticals where you want to use extremely low vector molecules. That is, the targeting molecules, you want it to be like extremely low. And in that case, the product of this nature will be extremely important. And that could be done. That's also another alternate method like, and that procedure is also available and it is being used. Both of them are there. I just want to mention one of the exercise for you in the assignment is going to be linked to this dual method of production and comparison pros and cons. Like, so remember this slide anyway, you will get to see it and then you will be able to do that assignment. And if you want to have a complement, here you have the beta energy relatively medium 0.5 MeV. If there are larger lesions, larger tumors, like where you want the deeper penetration of the radiation, then we would like to have a hard beta, what we call the higher energy beta, hard beta emitter, which is of the order of 2 MeV. In this case, yttrium-90 with 2.27 MeV, a 64-hour half-life. Again, a M3 chemistry advantage will be there. And this has been exploited well all across the world. And in India, we have an advantage because this yttrium is produced from strontium-90, which is a fission-based product. You remember we talked about accessibility to radioisotopes from reactor N-gamma reaction, N-gamma followed by decay. And we also said recovery from fission products. So this recovery comes from fission products from the spent fuel waste stream. And that we have in India, the technology available. So we have access to strontium. So the strontium yttrium separation then becomes important. Two methods have been worked out. One is based on the liquid brain based methodology. Another is an electrolytic method, both done in India by the colleagues, and they are available. Their principles, the full papers are available for you to read. But suffice to say, we have access to yttrium-90 to complement the lutetium. So between lutetium and yttrium, using the same type of carrier molecules, you can have a number of tumor imaging agents. So this is one way of achieving the hard beta. Another way is to access to the rhenium-188. What is the interest of rhenium? Rhenium is in the same periodic group, the same group in periodic table. It's a congener of the 99M technetium. Therefore, with technetium being the imaging agent, similar one for the rhenium was tried. Like, for example, in the case of bone imaging agent technetium MDP, you can have a rhenium phosphonate for the therapy part of it. But there is a little difficulty here. Once again, we go back to the nuclear reactions and the isotope production. Tungsten is produced by successive neutron capture. That means one neutron, one product, and one more neutron captured, one more product. Tungsten 186, N-gamma, tungsten 187, N-gamma, tungsten 188. Such successive neutron capture, when you come, the flux requirements becomes extremely high, of the order of 10 power 15 or so, which is not readily available. And therefore, the utility with yttrium-90 is more, but world over, those who have access to such reactors have rhenium-188 also. So you have two choices. The chemistry-wise, M3 chemistry and yttrium-90 for hard beta, or technetium's analog rhenium for the other hard beta, because here it is about 2.12 MeV. It is obtained from the tungsten 188, rhenium 188 again generator. Tungsten about 70-day half-life, and in this successive neutron capture, if you are able to produce, then with that we will be able to have enough of this material, like, and that's the other isotope. Like, now we stop with the isotopes used in therapy and get to see just two major areas of applications today in this lecture, and we'll continue with the other therapy applications in the subsequent part of that. We have all been telling that iodine has been the important one for thyroid and its therapy part of it. And the basic reason is that the iodine that you take gets from the bloodstream and into the thyroid gland, and the thyroid hormones are produced, and therefore that's having a very natural affinity to thyroid related cells. Now, in the case of a thyroid cancer type of the patient, the thyroid cancer cells, wherever the metastasis is there, they are still of thyroid origin. And therefore, the same iodine, whether it is iodine 131 or iodine 123, you will be able to use to do the imaging of the metastasis of the thyroid cancer. And very same way, if you are able to use the iodine 131, because iodine 123 is not having the beta emission, it's an electron capture nuclide, whereas iodine 131 is the beta emitter, and that can then destroy this metastasis of the thyroid cancer. So it was very early on visualized, and of course the iodine itself was discovered by Glenn Seaborg at 1938, but the ability that it could be used to attack thyroid cells using the iodine 131 radiation gave rise to two of the treatment. One is for the thyroid cancer, which is cancerous cells have to be destroyed. The other is also, we will see very briefly, which is kind of the overactivity of the thyroid, which we call the hyperactivity of the thyroid, or that's called thyrotoxicosis. By giving a modest quantity of radioisotope, you will be able to suppress that overactivity of the thyroid. What is the radiopharmaceutical here? It is the sodium iodide solution or sodium iodide capsule, which is just given to the patient for consuming, and then the particular procedure process is done. This is a treatment methodology which is not new. It's been there much earlier onwards, like perhaps even before I was born. Therefore, it's got more than 60 years history. And the good point is, thanks to Department of Atomic Energy, in India also this procedure and this process has been available since very early on. What's the procedure like? This is how the iodine solution is being taken by the particular patient. The iodine is kept inside the lead shield and the straw wise, and he is drinking the material. And basically what happens is, like here, the thyroid cancer patient will have to first undergo obviously the main tumor removal, which much of the time will mean most of the thyroid will be removed, and then the patient is only on the thyroid hormone. Instead of thyroid hormone, you take the drugs for that. You may not be able to completely 100% remove the entire thyroid. Therefore, some remnant will be left out, and that will be removed by what's known as an ablation dose. This can also be by the radioactive iodine. 30 to 50 millicurie doses can be given post-surgical removal of the main thyroid tumor and the thyroid itself together. That's what called the thyroidectomy. You have the ablation. And then when you image the patient with iodine, you will find where are all the metastases. And based on that, the DASP dose is calculated. It can anywhere be in the range of 100, 200, 250 millicuries. And that material is given. There are more than 80 centers in India. This will have to necessarily be done as an inpatient in special wards, where including the excreta, everything is considered radioactive waste. Accordingly, the isolation, the taking care of the whole thing is there. The nurses are trained. The people are trained there, and this procedure has been available, and thousands of patients, nearly a few thousands of patients, are being treated. In fact, thyroid cancer is one in which virtually a near assured cure is available thanks to this type of a procedure, compared to many other cancers where probably the problem. It is not again like not all the 100% of the thyroid cancer patients will be eligible. There are actually the clinical decision making, which are the type of patients who will be able to. And whoever are selected as fully qualifying for going through this procedure, they get a much higher degree of curative. Well over 90-95% of a curative capability has been demonstrated, and therefore this procedure has been extremely popular and well utilized. And so much so, in a lighter vein, one can say, if cancer is inevitable, I have to get one, I will as well opt for thyroid cancer because there is a treatment available for that too. We leave the thyroid cancer there and we come to this other category called hyperthyroidism. That's the overactivity of the thyroid. This is not cancer. It's a non-cancerous situation, thyrotoxic or Graves' disease. You will suddenly find some people some are very symptomatic, very well known, but some people could suddenly have an extreme weight loss. One of the reasons can be some cancer which the doctors will check. And one more reason can be at that time, this thyroid has suddenly become extraordinarily hyperactive, overactive, and that's been taking away all the kind of the body, the energy residues mass, and therefore the patient had been very drastically losing weight and then coming down. That type of a situation could be there. In such cases, the hyperthyroidism to be attacked, one will be lifelong what is known as the anti-thyroid drug. Anti-thyroid drugs are available like neomercazole, which has to be taken permanently lifelong. You cannot afford to forget. But sometimes the overactivity will be so high, it will place a heavy pressure on the heart to overact and be exerting itself. In such a situation, like the doctors do need a rather a quicker method of controlling the hyperthyroidism. And for such quick control, 5 to 15 millicuries of the iodine 131 is administered, and that ensures that the people will be able to be treated well with the procedure. And this methodology is not requiring an inpatient. Here the patient could be treated and after a few hours can be sent out. Essentially, whatever is not retained in the thyroid will be excreted in the urine. Correspondingly, the patient and the caretakers are advised what to take care, how to prevent radioactive contamination, etc. And the procedure goes on. And a very, very large number of patients. Very early on, they will keep these procedures only for relatively elderly, but much later with all the important information, data gathered and made available, like people have taken this procedure even for many other age group people. So much so, this becomes extremely and useful outpatient procedure involving relatively smaller amount of iodine 131 active. So one cancerous situation, thyroid cancer, another non-cancerous thing of Graves' disease or thyrotoxicosis, overactivity of the thyroid part of it. Of course, this is the two procedures where the iodine is used, and we will come back to our bone scan and the related one particular problem for patients and how the radiopharmaceutical or nuclear medicine can help there. That will be the last part of the lecture today. We mentioned that the prostate cancer, lung cancer, and breast cancer often leads to cancer metastasis in the bone. And these patients, many of them will be terminal cases, and the cancer spread may not be focal in one or two places. They could be like what we call diffuse multiple sites. We saw in many of the images in the bone scan, fairly very large number of places where the the lesions have been there. The reason is, if it is focal, 1 or 2 or 3, you can even give the radiation externally to those parts of the patient and give him some palliation from the pain. It's not curative. It's essentially pain reduction and helping improve the quality of life, because these are terminal patients. They are anyway going to eventually meet their end, but their quality of life can be improved. But if it is not 1 or 2 spots, if it is like in this case in the image as it shows in that many multiple spots, you can't give external radiation to the whole body. Like that way, we will be creating more damage to the patient than to the particular tumor alone. So it is in that cases, the radiopharmaceutical which will go to all those bone mets alone, and there if it will be having the beta radiation to deposit the radiation energy there, can be a very helpful procedure. And you have a very nice calcium analog isotope in strontium 89, which has got a 50-day half-life and a beta energy of 1.5 MeV. Strontium 89 is produced and in the form of strontium chloride, because strontium is an alkaline earth metal, exactly like a calcium bone mineral it will behave. So strontium is going to be taken up in all those bone metastatic places, and because of the beta radiation given, it will give to the pain relief. This is not curative, this is purely palliative. These are terminal cancer patients whose quality of life gets very bad because of the intractable bone pain, and the analgesics don't work, and they get into a poorer mobility and poorer quality of life. So till the end, like a pain palliation, what could be brought by these, for these cases where the metastasis is very diffuse across the body, has been an extremely important one. So strontium was one analog which was very well utilized. It is available. It has to be imported at that time. There were some difficulties in producing it because it's got an extremely low cross section and a low abundance. So you needed a very, very high flux reactor to be able to produce the strontium 89, and that was not readily available. There were other alternates which we have produced in India, but because strontium was directly a derivable radiopharmaceutical based on biochemical principle, we are looking for a calcium analog radioisotope with a beta emission. Strontium 89, 1.5 MeV, 50-day half-life isotope. Boom, you have already achieved the right isotope, you use it. More recently came one more calcium analog and an alpha emitter. You remember calcium, strontium, barium, and then comes radium in the same group in the periodic table. So radium-223 has radium chloride. It's 11-day half-life alpha emitter. It's again like alpha activities are not so very commonly known or used available like, But recently it became, and it's of course a commercial product, patented, so bit expensive. But they have found that that could also be very, because very similar to strontium, but at the same time its radiation is going to be much more confined in that part, like therefore it could also be extremely effective. So this is another of the alternative from the for the bone pain palliation. Again, not curative, only palliative. But when the strontium had the problem, what could be the alternate? Because we said phosphonates is what was used with technetium for getting the bone imaging. Then why not phosphonate with a kind of a therapeutic nuclide? And that's how your samarium 153, another of the radiolanthanide based material, samarium 153, which is a beta emitter, 2-day half-life, 48-hour E beta is about 0.8 MeV. It could be like complexed with phosphonate. In addition, it so happens the phosphonate itself has been used as a pharma for bone pain palliation in cancer patients. The phosphonates are known to have pharmacological effect. So phosphonates were already being used in large quantities, milligram quantities, doses in the cancer patients. So the idea here was we take the radioisotope and the phosphonate as a complex. So you are also adding the radiation to the phosphonate, and then you are going to be giving the patient the pain palliation. And that's what gave rise to samarium 1 phosphonate. It is ethylene diamine tetramethylene phosphonate. It's equivalent of the EDTA. EDTA, instead of the acetic acid, you have methylene phosphonate group here. And that analog, this product under the commercial name Lexidronam, has been making a big inroad, and that has been very helpful, 0.5 to 1 millicurie per kg, and samarium is relatively easy to produce, and we were producing in India for over 30 years. This product has been available. So till in the 80s or so, if only strontium had to be imported and used, we do have other alternatives, phosphonate based compounds commercially is also available. So metastron alone, instead, the samarium phosphonate Lexitronam had also been there since 90s. With lutetium coming and lutetium samarium being very similar chemistry, a very natural process was, why not use the lutetium itself? Because lutetium and samarium only limited 0.8 MeV and 0.5 MeV, the two energy range. Lutetium is 0.5. I'm sorry, here it's a mistake. Samarium is the 0.8 and lutetium is 0.5. And a very similar dose, 1 millicurie per kg type of dose. And this could be of help. So again, between IAEA and India, this product has been launched and it's now widely used. With a 2-hour half-life isotope to be exclusively produced for this. Instead, now that we are producing very large amount of lutetium anyway every week, you can reduce your inventory. You need not produce both samarium and lutetium. Lutetium itself with EDTMP could be of help, and that is what has now taken over. And that material is being extremely largely used. Once again, the rhenium interest for those, because it's the technetium analog, it's possible. Rhenium isotope, rhenium 188 I mentioned, and another phosphonate. Here it is hydroxyethylene diphosphonate is the material, and that is what is used. A word about the bone met spine palliation before we close today's talk. This is helpful for those patients who are having very large number of metastases in a diffused manner all across the body. If it will be focally available in 2-3 spots, external radiation is still preferred, and not this particular palliative, this radiopharmaceutical nuclear medicine therapy. Therefore, and also this is only in the case of the terminal patients because of giving the better quality of life. Unlike the iodine therapy for the thyroid cancer, or what we are going to see, strategic tumor targeting and tumor therapy in the next lecture part, the utility had been less, but for an important group of people. These are terminal people, and even if their things are numbered days or months or weeks, in that period, if they can have a better quality of life, better mobility, it's been true that they have been able to show that people who could otherwise be crippled on the bed could go about moving normal thing till their end life. And that's been a great contribution of these bone mets. That's why I said it's limited in volume by and large in the terminal cases, but it still plays a very important role. This is like the trailer to the next lecture. We are going to move from these two, that's the bone pain palliation, thyroid related, to strategic tumor targeting. Very specific tumors we are interested. We mentioned about the neuroendocrine tumor, pancreatic tumor. Can we do directly therapy with that? A gallium pharmaceutical for a pancreatic cancer imaging, and then a lutetium, the same radiopharmaceutical with that to go for a therapeutic one. The same vector, that is the peptide based or whatever is the binder molecule that you are going to use, diagnostic imaging isotope like gallium for imaging, and then the beta emitting isotope like lutetium, or even the alpha emitter actinium. That will be possible, and that's available, and that's what's going to be the excitement in the next lecture. So this is the trailer end towards the next lecture. I'll stop it here as the end of the lecture 3, and the next one we will continue in for the first half of the next lecture.